Hi everyone, welcome to our Instagram Live on occasion of Banned Books Week. As you probably know, the Dots has a library with over 5,000 titles. Most of them are American literature, fiction, graphic novels, young adult literature, and nonfiction about the US, covering topics such as politics, history, social issues, culture, and so on. We thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about book bans in the United States. To do so, we've invited Sumi Somaskanda. She is an American journalist who has covered culture wars in the United States, including the rising number of book bans and challenge books across America. She lived and worked in Berlin for 14 years before taking her current post as Washington correspondent for Deutsche Welle or DW News. I'm going to see if she's already here. I think I already found her. And I will let her in now. Questions for Sumi, you can post them in the question tool. Something. Here she is. Hi,
Hey,
Sumi.
Katarina. Hi.
Welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here in our little library to talk about book bans. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of it. I love your library, by the way. It's the dream
Thank you.
library.
Thank you. It's a really nice backdrop. We use it all the time if we have, we have all these books, so it's a nice atmosphere. I was just telling people that if they have questions for you, they should use the question tool at the bottom and we will get to them later.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. You just came back from the field reporting on another important issue, but in the past you've covered book bans, I think earlier this year. So let's dive in because I'm not sure how familiar people are with the topic. Let's start with the basics. What are book bans?
I think it's great that you asked that basic question because I think the word is banned or the term is bandied about so much here in the US now that we just assume that everyone understands what we're talking about. But generally, in the context of the US, but also globally, we're talking about when books or teaching materials, pamphlets, reading materials are they are controlled. The deployment of these materials is controlled, whether it be in a school or a library, a university, because it is believed that the content in that material is inappropriate or controversial. And so it can be removed or challenged, which I think we're going to talk about as well. But it could also be that it's taken out of a curriculum entirely. So that's generally what we're discussing. And this is certainly not an American phenomenon, and it's not something new. I mean, I think it's important to say that we've seen book bans over the course of our written history, of human written history. And Europe is certainly no stranger to book bans either. I mean,
Yes.
we've seen, from the Spanish Inquisition to the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, with the burning of books, of course. I think it's just important to highlight that we're discussing the US, but of course, there are books and materials that are banned in China and Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia, in Singapore, the Philippines. So this is a phenomenon that we witness everywhere, but in the context of the US right now, it is certainly a big topic.
So since we're talking about the US, what kind of books are banned, or when we talk about book bans, what sort of materials are affected? Is it new publications? Is it classics? Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, or like where do we find book bans?
So it spans the entire breadth of all of what you just mentioned. So old books and classics to new books to even the Bible is one of the books that is challenged often, which is, I know, quite surprising. You would think that's not the case. I did look up some numbers before I joined this Insta Live because I was reporting on this earlier this year. And so I wanted to make sure I had the freshest numbers just to give an idea to people of what we're talking about. So just pulling up the numbers I saw from the American Library Association, there were 681 attempts to ban or restrict books between January 1st and August 31st this year. And if you look at last year, it was around 700. And to get an idea of whether that's more or less, between 2018 and 2020, that number was around 200 to 400. So we are certainly seeing this spike. And, you know, in the state of Texas alone, a state representative there, a Republican representative, sent a letter to the state education department saying that there are more than 800 books that need to be taken out of the curriculum because they are not considered appropriate. So this is something that we've seen all over the country, but in particularly in conservative states. And back to your question about what types of books, we are seeing any books that kind of fall along the lines of America's culture wars, are the ones that are most often targeted. So these are books that touch upon topics like race, gender, sexuality, feminism, gay rights, all of these topics. They are also in past years have involved certain types of fantasy or science fiction. For example, Harry Potter was banned often because it was considered glorifying witchcraft, but which, you know, that wasn't a successful challenge, I believe, in those libraries. But the vast majority of the books that are challenged today are books that have main characters or themes that have to do with Black people or LGBTQ plus themes. So that's a long answer to your question, but those are the ones that are most targeted today. And, you know, of Mice and Men, you know, classics like Of Mice and Men have been targeted. The Catcher in the Rye is one that's often challenged, but the current wave that we have witnessed and that we covered when we were working on the story earlier this year had a lot to do with recent books, current books that have come out, particularly on race and on gender.
Yeah, you mentioned The Catcher in the Rye. We shared some challenge books that we have in our library over the course of this weekend. This was one of them, in addition, or one of the classics, in addition of some of the newer books. Those were mostly about LGBTQ plus topics and race-related stories. So who are, I mean, you mentioned politicians, but who are the people who are challenging the books? Who's in charge of the book bans, or who are the parties involved in getting books banned?
That's a really good question. It's important because we often think of it in a very political context, but it goes right down to the most grassroots level, which is parents. So this is also very much a question about parents' rights. So many of the challenges that we're seeing in the US are coming from parents who believe that certain books that are either in their libraries or in their schools' curricula are not appropriate or suited for their children. So that also goes to parents' associations, and some of the biggest battles are happening in school board associations, school board meetings. Those are where we've seen some of the largest or the loudest, let's say, fights over which books should be allowed. This is also happening on library administrative levels. So one more troubling trend is before a book has even been challenged or banned, if there's questions asked about it, we've seen some libraries preemptively take them out of their supply for review because of the fear of what types of challenges and debates might come or be sparked by the books even existing in their collection in the library. So there's that, but there's also, there's been a larger grassroots conservative movement. So there's a group called Moms for Liberty, for example, and this is a socially conservative, right-wing group of parents led by moms mostly, who have led a concerted grassroots effort across the country, as they say, to take back control of their own children's education and the teaching of what they call woke curriculum. So curriculum that has been taken out of their hands and has gone over to the side of, and I'm quoting their words, now critical race theory, wokeness, gender craze, and so on and so forth. So those are the topics that, those are the groups rather that are pushing this agenda mostly.
And is this also a difference to book bans in the past? I mean, you talked about how it's not a recent phenomena, but since the book bans and challenges are at an all-time high, is this or how is the current wave different? Is that something that factors into it, or is there different reasons to that as well?
I think, it's a good question. It's one that I asked an expert who wrote a book on culture wars, Andrew Hartman in Illinois, because I was curious to see from the perspective of a historian, is the current wave of book bans and polarization that different from the past? And he said, I think quite poignantly, America has never not been polarized. And this is always an issue that cooks back up when there are no other major crises to be currently dealt with, which I find interesting because, of course, we're still in the middle of a pandemic and various other issues. But regardless, I think one of the points that he made that seems to ring true from what I've seen here on the ground is that we have seen these challenges and efforts before. What is different is that it's been co-opted by, if I can say that, by the Republican Party and used as one of their platforms of social conservatism. And that has thrust this topic into the center of debate. And so for that reason, we've seen major media networks also covering these book bans. On the one hand, that has given it perhaps a lot more attention than in the past, and that has led to more books being challenged. On the other, one thing that's important to note is just because a book is challenged doesn't mean it's removed from a curriculum. And you've seen such an outcry over things like a school district in the state of Tennessee removing the graphic novel Mouse, or Anna Frank's Diary, that's led such associations to take a critical look at why such books are being challenged and whether they really shouldn't be included in curriculum or in libraries. And that's been, in some way, that attention has been an effective tool to fight back against such challenges. But I would say the difference now is just how politicized and it has become, and how much it's been adopted as a talking point by conservatives.
And since the midterms are coming up, have you noticed a change? I mean, you reported on this earlier this year. Have you noticed how this has evolved in the public discourse, on the campaign trail, or just also with media outlets covering it or addressing it since you were in the field and talking to these different parties involved? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's only grown bigger, and I say that with the topic kind of being on in the headlines so much at the start of the year, but also generally throughout the course of the year. I think it's a topic and a subject that has gotten so much attention because it is precisely about this very fundamental issue of people's children and their university educations. And I think one thing that I found interesting in the debate leading up to the midterms is something that I saw a conservative outlet write, I believe, or say, I'm not entirely sure anymore, about why this topic is of such importance to conservatives. And it's because they see actually universities have become the turf of the left. And that's a territory that they can no longer win back. And because of that, they're putting all the more attention and resources into ensuring that the lower stages of education for children are ones where conservative agendas can be implemented. And because of that, and because it's such an important issue in conservative states, it's been a central topic. There's no question about it.
Americans, or the US in general, prides itself on freedom of speech. It's covered by the First Amendment. How does freedom of speech relate to, or how does it even allow for book bans if freedom of speech is such an important part of American culture, politics, legislation? How do those two go together?
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting question. Of course, it doesn't go together in the sense that the majority of Americans on both sides of the political aisle, although I don't see it as a black and white, both sides of the aisle, regardless, don't believe in book bans and don't advocate censorship of books, whether they be in libraries or in school curricula. So it's important to say that. That being said, I think we have to take a critical view to America's freedom of speech, because for a long time, minority groups, women, Black Americans have not been granted that same right of freedom of speech. So it's a foundation upon which this country was built, and yet it hasn't been a right. Hasn't been a right that's been granted to many Americans. There's been a gatekeeping, if you will, that hasn't allowed some groups of Americans to speak freely and demand that freedom of speech in the way that the majority has. And I think what we've seen in recent years, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, is that as some of these groups have demanded that right, we're seeing a backlash. And indeed, those are precisely the books where you see minority groups writing about race, about gender, about discrimination. Those are the books that are being targeted. So I think this in many ways reflects that backlash.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm not sure how to segue into this next part. You've talked about the parents being involved in the school boards. How are those measures, like the challenges from like top down, how are they different from curating curriculum or learning materials, or the library collections themselves? I mean, you mentioned that some libraries are worried and will not voluntarily not put books into their collections. Like how where's the line between that, or where would you say that balance is out of, or that scale is out of balance between something that's done voluntarily and like the administrative side, how those two are connected?
Well, sure. I mean, whenever a teacher is putting together a curriculum, it involves bringing in books into that curriculum and perhaps leaving some out. So there's always a selection process that is happening, mm-hmm. also for a library. I think what's important to remember is that such curricula and also a library's collection is put together with, first of all, a group of people who understand very well the literature. So let's call them experts, let's say, the literature that is being included in these libraries. And often those, by the way, are not the people who are being targeted when people come in and complain to a library. It's often just the people who are working at the front desk, let's say, and who are not responsible for making those decisions. But regardless, there is a concerted effort to include a broad bandwidth of books and literature for people to be able to access. And that also happens in the course of a conversation and a debate. And I think when the line gets crossed, or let's say when the boundaries get pushed, is when these decisions are made under pressure. And that's the big difference between curating a collection, like you said, and having to remove books or put in books because of pressure from parents or from politics, from a state government. That is when there starts to be this process of self-censorship that I mentioned with libraries, mm-hmm. out of fear removing certain books. There was, by the way, a teacher, or there have been teachers who have been fired for speaking out against such book bans. And there was recently in Norman, Oklahoma, an example. Many of you will know that the Brooklyn Public Library has been very vocal about the fact that they want to make sure that all children and all people across the country can access all books, all banned books as well, on their online public library. And so they have made those books accessible to people. Now, there was a teacher in Norman, Oklahoma, who recently put up a QR code in his classroom, or her classroom, I have to check. But that teacher was then fired for showing children where they could access these books. So we're talking not only about a debate over what children should be taught and what role parents should play, but rather we're talking about real censorship in this case.
Yeah. Before I go to my next question, that perfectly fits to what you just said, I want to remind everyone that if you have a question, you can use the question tool, and then Sumi can answer it towards the end. You just mentioned real life consequences for teachers who provided access to books. What are more or what are some other consequences how book bans affect students, librarians, teachers in, their work life or their education?
Yeah, so the first consequence is the one that I mentioned, is that they feel intimidated or pressured into not teaching certain materials. I think it also changes the way that they approach certain fundamental subjects that are important. We're talking about historical subjects. So one of the group that we interviewed in doing our story in Tennessee, which is a state that has seen many challenges to books, the Moms for Liberty group there displayed a number of books to me that they found questionable. They basically went through the curriculum and pointed out which books that they found questionable. And one of them was a beautiful book about Martin Luther King Jr. And what they objected to was not the book or the character, of course, or his words, but rather the depictions, the illustrations that were used to depict Black versus white and how that vision looked for Martin Luther King Jr. and for Black people at the time. And what it meant for teachers, where that book was challenged, was that a book that had been a fundamental part of teaching a certain, or teaching in a certain way what Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideology had been and what his words had been and what an important figure he was in American history, couldn't be used. And not only does that cause teachers to scramble, but they think very carefully, of course, and curricula are planned carefully along which books are the best suited for kids and are best suited to teach them the lessons that Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to impart. And I'm using that one example, but I think the consequences there are that it becomes very hard to actually find the right books for your curriculum and to teach children what are important lessons of history. The larger consequence, of course, is that we're getting towards a debate about censorship and who should be able to make decisions on what a child is taught. Of course, parents absolutely know and that they must have the right to have a say in their children's education, but at some point it's to the detriment of children and to schools as well if that debate prevents teachers from being able to impart important lessons.
That's right. I also read somewhere that students might not be as college ready because they lack critical thinking skills that if they attend schools that or school districts that have higher rates of book bans because it just changes the environment in the classroom. So
that's a good point. And just to add to that, there was actually a banned children in one school district, I believe in Pennsylvania, that actually came together and held their own banned book club because they wanted to make sure really cool. Precisely that they would be able to develop critical thinking skills. So that's a good point.
And that's also an important aspect. Like, how are students? Like, you mentioned it's like the parents, concerned politicians. Are children, teenagers included in this discussion debate, and how are they reacting to it? How are they fighting back against it? Maybe also.
Yeah, the short answer to that is not really. No, they're not really included in this decision. And I just gave you an example of how they're fighting back against it. But there have been a lot of protests, and there have been students who have complained to their school districts as well. But quite frankly, their opinions have not been taken into account necessarily in the types of books that are challenged and what should be included in the curriculum.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that books are provided online for students who might be affected by the book bans. In the age of the internet, do book bans even matter if students have access to materials, topics, resources online? Are they like, is it even possible to shield them from these quote unquote dangerous influences?
Yeah, I mean, I guess not really. You can just look at the fact that a lot of libraries that have had to remove books physically from their collection offer them online. So that is always an option for people who are looking to access books that have been challenged. They also have digital checkout systems. And like I mentioned, the Brooklyn Public Library, we were also, when we were in Tennessee, went to the Nashville Public Library, and they also had an online offering of banned books. So no, not necessarily, but on the other hand, I think, again, this is a part of a larger, more worrying trend about the idea of who controls education and what should be taught, and whether the fact that it's seen as a turf, where universities are the left's turf and lower education and elementary education should be the turf of the right. I think that kind of thinking, where that becomes so politicized, is concerning, even if children can still access these books.
Yeah. Well, also the wider this gap, the wider it becomes, the more of a disruption is between the path of education from the elementary and secondary level to higher education, if there is higher education, since that's not as widely accessible in the US, due to a lot of reasons. You mentioned your field work and talking to people. Like when you talk to parents, teachers, librarians, on both sides of this issue, what was the most surprising realization or aspect that you came across during your research?
I think what surprised me the most in talking to parents on both sides of a series of book challenges in Franklin County in Tennessee, which is just outside of Nashville, was just how close together they actually were in a lot of issues. Of course, they only wanted the best for their kids and that their kids received a good education. And yet their approach to that issue was so vastly different. What surprised me, of course, is just how deep the antagonism towards critical race theory runs. So critical race theory, for anyone who's not familiar with it, academic concept that looks at how racism is embedded in structures and in policy. And for the mothers that I spoke to with Moms for Liberty, they see it as an incredibly divisive theory that is a mark. I found that an interesting intellectualization of an approach that at the end of the day, what these moms were essentially telling me was that they wanted to be able to have a say in when their kids learned about race, gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth. And I think there was actually a lot more common ground than I expected between these groups.
That's interesting. That's not something that you would expect.
Yeah.
In that, especially in today's political climate, when it comes to conservative and liberal like camps in the United States.
Yeah.
We had one person ask, what can we do about it, or what can Americans, I think most Americans do not support book bans. What can Americans do to work against book bans or fight against book bans, either in their own communities or also on a regional, state level and so on?
I think actually their own communities is the most important platform, because that's where the most important conversations are taking place on the types of books and materials that are being taught. And I think sometimes it involves just showing up to school board meetings, showing up to parent-teachers meetings. And of course, it's not that parents don't show up, but of course, it's not necessarily an issue. Or let's say it's something that maybe parents have taken for granted in the past, that their child's curriculum will be their child's curriculum. I think showing up and voicing your opposition to the banning of Anna Frank's diary, for example, or Mouse from a school curriculum is incredibly important. Just because these debates are happening with maybe one or two books in one school board doesn't make it any less important, because those are the, let's say, small battles that then inform what happens on a larger scale. So I think that's probably the most effective way that can happen. And of course, the other thing is to support libraries and bookstores that house collections of all sorts of books, whether they're banned or challenged or not. That is always an important priority for anyone who supports or is against the banning of books. And there are so many libraries that have provided a wealth of resources to all Americans, digitally as well, as you mentioned. So those are the things that I think Americans can certainly do to ensure that they have access to, and their children have access to, all materials that they want.
Perfect, thank you. It also goes to show that, like, especially here in Germany, when we think about American politics, it's usually presidential elections. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking about the midterms. For those of you who don't know, we'll have a bunch of events on the midterms coming up too. But it shows that politics on a local level is really important, because that
Yes.
has a huge impact, and especially individuals can have a huge impact on politics by voting, but also running for, things like school boards and so on and so forth. Um, we're at the end of our time with you. I want to close this live with a quote by young adult literature author Jason Reynolds. He said, "The point of books is to encourage discourse. The purpose of the book is to create landscape for us to wrestle with that which we believe or don't believe in. And it's important that we keep this opportunity at the forefront." And I thought this was a really nice quote, showing that it's not, that it's important to read things that are outside of your own experience, outside of your own belief system, just to, you don't have to agree with it, but you should have an open mind, and just sit with the content and think about it, and just get to know it, and try to see a different perspective. If you're in Stuttgart and would like to do so, we have a ton of books here. We're really proud that our collection houses a diverse set of authors, and it showcases the variety of American experiences. So if you're local, we invite you to come by and check out some books. Sumi, thank you so much for joining us today, and shedding some light into this topic that's really important, an important aspect of democracy, and on occasion of Banned Books Week. I know you have to go back to editing your story. Are we allowed to say what you're reporting on, or do we have to wait until it comes out? Okay, share. What's your current story?
At the moment, we are reporting on immigrants who have been bused or flown from the border region, Texas, Arizona, Florida, to northern cities in a political move. So we've been speaking to migrants who have made their way, mostly Venezuelan migrants, about their experience and how they see themselves being used as pawns in this political game between Republicans and Democrats.
So once again, the two sides of conservative and liberal perspectives on in the political arena, and how everyday people are affected by it. I'm looking forward to see your story when it comes out. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you soon sometime. Bye.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.